Hello, and welcome back to the Southern Bible Thumper channel. For this upload, we will be reading Numbers chapter 11. And when the people complained, it displeased the Lord, and the Lord heard it, and his anger was kindled. And the fire of the Lord burnt among them, and consumed them that were in the uttermost parts of the camp. And the people cried unto Moses, and when Moses prayed unto the Lord, the fire was quenched. And he called the name of the place Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burnt among them. And the mixed multitude that was among them fell a lusting. And the children of Israel also wept again, and said, Who shall give us flesh to eat? We remember the fish, which we did eat in Egypt freely, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. But now our soul is dried away. There is nothing at all beside this manna before our eyes. And the manna was as coriander seed, and the color thereof was as the color of bdellium. And the people went about and gathered it, and ground it in mills, or beat it in a mortar, and baked it in pans, and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was as the taste of fresh oil. And when the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell upon it. Then Moses heard the people weep throughout their families, every man in the door of his tent. And the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly. Moses was also displeased. And Moses said unto the Lord, Wherefore hast thou afflicted thy servant? And wherefore have I not found favor in thy sight, that thou layest the burden of all this people upon me? Have I conceived all this people? Have I begotten them, that thou shouldest say unto me, Carry them in thy bosom, as a nursing father beareth the sucking child, unto the land which thou swarest unto their fathers? Whence should I have flesh to give unto all these people? For they weep unto me, saying, Give us flesh, that we may eat. If I am not able to bear all these people alone, because it is too heavy for me. And if thou deal thus with me, kill me, I pray thee, out of hand, if I have found favor in thy sight, and let me not see my wretchedness. And the Lord said unto Moses, Gather unto me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom thou knowest to be the elders of the people, and officers over them, and bring them unto the tabernacle of the congregation, that they may stand there with thee. And I will come down and talk with thee there, and I will take up the spirit which is upon me, and will put it upon them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with thee, that thou bear it not thyself alone. And say thou unto the people, Sanctify yourselves against tomorrow, and ye shall eat flesh. For ye have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, Who shall give us flesh to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will give you flesh, and ye shall eat. Ye shall not eat 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, neither 10 days, nor 20 days, but even a whole month, until it come out at your nostrils, and it be loathsome unto you, because that ye have despised the Lord which is among you. And I have wept before him, saying, Why came we forth out of Egypt? And Moses said, The people among whom I am are 600,000 footmen, and thou hast said, I will give them flesh, that they may eat a whole month. Shall the flocks and the herds be slain for them, to suffice them? Or shall all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them, to suffice them? And the Lord said unto Moses, Is the Lord's hand waxed short? Thou shalt see now whether my word shall come to pass unto thee or not. And Moses went out and told the people the words of the Lord, and gathered the 70 men of the elders of the people, and set them round about the tabernacle. And the Lord came down in a cloud, and spake unto him, and took the spirit that was upon him, and gave it unto the 70 elders. And it came to pass, that when the spirit rested upon them, they prophesied, and did not cease. But there remained 2 of the men in the camp. The name of the one was Eldad, and the name of the other Medad, and the spirit rested upon them. And they were of them that were written, but went not out unto the tabernacle, and they prophesied in the camp. And there ran a young man, and told Moses, and said, Eldad and Medad do prophecy in the camp. And Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of Moses, one of his young men, answered and said, My lord Moses, forbid them. And Moses said unto him, Enviest thou for my sake? Would God that all the Lord's people were prophets, and that the Lord would put his spirit upon them? And Moses gat him into the camp, he and the elders of Israel. And there went forth a wind from the Lord, and brought quails from the sea, and let them fall by the camp, as it were a day's journey on this side, and as it were a day's journey on the other side, round about the camp, and as it were 2 cubits high upon the face of the earth. And the people stood up all that day, and all that night, and all the next day, and they gathered the quails. He that gathered least gathered 10 homers, and they spread them all abroad for themselves round about the camp. And while the flesh was yet between their teeth, ere it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was kindled against the people. And the Lord smote the people with a very great plague. And he called the name of that place Kibrothava, because they buried the people that lusted. And the people journeyed from Kibrothava unto Hazeroth, and abode at Hazeroth. Summarizing Numbers chapter 11, but before I go into chapter 11, I'd like to just summarize what we've been over in the book of Numbers up until this point. The Israelites are preparing to enter the land of Canaan. In chapter 1, God assigns leaders and military force from the men of Israel in the Sinai wilderness. In chapter 2, God organizes camp arrangements, and the Bible records the number of men from each family lineage. In chapter 3, God specifies the Levite family as having the status as the firstborn in Numbers chapter 3, verse 40. This is significant because of the plague that God sent to the Egyptians when Israel was enslaved there. The designation of firstborn males by God is mentioned in Exodus chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. That's the first time the firstborn is mentioned in the Bible. Aaron and his sons are assigned to supervise the Levites. Their responsibility is to manage the tabernacle and transport it as Israel travels. God requires a ransom redemption offering from Israel in Numbers chapter 3, verse 44 through 51. Israel donates $174,720 to Aaron and his sons in verse 51 in accordance with God's command. In chapter 4, God clarifies the age requirements among the Levites of tabernacle responsibilities. God details the way of the Levites are to handle the holy instruments. Verses 5 through verse 15, Aaron and his sons are to wrap the instruments before allowing the Kohath clan of the Levite family to carry them. In chapter 5, God commands Israel to separate people with certain illnesses away from the population to avoid contaminating everyone. This chapter also addresses confessions for trespass and the procedure for jealous men to follow up with the priest. Chapter 6 details the special vow of the Nazarite and what the people should do to honor the vow. Chapter 7 is an extensive detailing of each Israelite leader mentioned in Numbers chapter 1, verses 5 through 16, and the offerings that they gave. Chapter 8, there's a special ceremony offering the Levites. In verse 24 through verse 26, additional age requirements are given for tabernacle service. Chapter 9, God reminds Israel to remember and honor the Passover. The Bible details God's manifestation as a cloud by night and fire by day to lead Israel in travel. In chapter 10, God commands Israel to create 2 trumpets to have special sounds to help command and guide Israel's new military force. Israel leaves the Sinai wilderness to enter the wilderness of Paran in verses 11 through 12. So now we're at chapter 11. Israel complained where God could hear. God's anger manifested as fire that consumed some people. Verse 2, Israel cried to Moses, who prayed to the Lord, then the fire died. Verse 3, Moses gave the spot that the burning occurred a name, Taberah, which means burning. Verse 4, some of the people in Israel began to, some of these translations say had a craving for different food, and here in the King James, a lusting. And they are basically not satisfied with the food. They want something else to eat. And this was interesting to me because I own a King James version. That's what I'm reading from. But the word lusting was used here in the King James, but in every other translation, the word crave was used. I thought that was interesting because in the Interlinear Bible, this is the closest translation that we have to the original Hebrew format of the way the Bible is written. So we have here craving in verse 4. So I'm not quite sure why lust would have been used with every translation. Personal opinion with translation, it's part of translating because most languages don't translate completely and cleanly. So there's not a word for every Hebrew word will not translate over to English perfectly. So the person who's doing the translating has to make some decisions, and it's based on their opinion on what word would fit better for some passages. So I just do wonder why lusting would have been used when lust has a connotation for sexual desire or lasciviousness, whereas crave doesn't necessarily have a connotation that is, the same way lust does. So that's just something that I noticed there. I also noticed that happen again in verse 6. Our strength is dried up, and when we look at the interlinear, the, our whole being is dried up. So our whole being, our whole strength, that would, it's a difference, but our strength and our appetite, I'm not quite sure why these other English translations would have just chose the term appetite, but then I also don't know why the King James would have chose the term lust when you could have just used the term crave. But it's just these small, these are small, and you can still get the same, a general understanding of what was meant by this. But just the fact that there's an option to translate more closely to the original form, and people are choosing not to, and that does affect the message that you get when you're reading. But that's something to keep in mind as we're reading. So again, verse 5, verse 6, the people are talking about, all we have is this manna. And then in verse 5, they're talking about, remember when we were in Egypt, we had fish, we had cucumbers, melons. And so one note or one idea that I had when I was reading this is that I kind of understand this. Getting manna from the ground and eating the same thing every day can be, it can lead to a person wanting more. The thing about that I also, or the other thought that I had when I was reading is like, God doesn't have a physical body like humans. So remember in Genesis chapter 1, God hovered over the face of the earth. So if he does have a body, he doesn't have one exactly like humans have. And even though he made creation, to really understand what a human is, you would have to live in a human body, which is part of why I think Jesus was created. But in order to understand what it means to be a human and to eat the same thing every day, you need to be a human. And so God, it's the same discrepancy as if a parent is buying shoes for a child and a child wants a special kind of shoes because they're going to school, they want Jordans, but they have parents that only understood, if I have shoes, that's enough. So I'm providing you with shoes. Isn't that enough? You should be grateful. This is how I saw that. But again, that is my my analysis. The Bible doesn't say that. That's why this happened. But this is what I see when I read this. You have a parent, or you have God, the provider, who's providing sustenance, and people are unhappy because they don't understand that, they don't understand how good they've got it. So both sides have a legitimate point. But that also leads into the next thing. Again, I will always bring up Genesis chapter 25, verses 22 and 23, Rebekah's pregnancy. Rebekah was Jacob and Esau's mother, but in Genesis, she had a difficult pregnancy. So she went to God, and she went to him in verse 22. Verse 23, God answered her and explained why she was having a difficult pregnancy. And so the difference with Rebekah and with the Egyptians, Rebecca did not have a history of slavery. So another thing, oppression affects the mindset. So when you're so used to not being able to think for yourself, and you've been hindered, and all you've had to do is exist and listen to orders, it impacts how the perception works. So it doesn't even occur to the Israelites to ask God for something themselves. It doesn't even occur to them to try to find their own solutions. They're either looking to Moses for a solution, or they're complaining, which is the next thing. People who complain probably don't talk to God. They don't think to talk to God. They just complain and then wonder why they feel even more miserable. The other thing that I wondered here was, do the Israelites have an understanding of God as being omnipresent? Because it doesn't seem like they do. We get to verses 7 through 9, and this is detailing how the manna looked and how they gathered it. Verse 10, the Israelites wept, which made God's anger kindle. And then in verse 14, Moses tells God that he's overwhelmed and to just kill him if this is how God is going to treat him. So Moses tells God that, like, yeah, if this is how it's going to be, just kill me. He felt comfortable enough with God to tell him that. And the other thing, again, that I mentioned with being oppressed and having the ability to either try to find your own solutions or to go to God for yourself. Moses didn't grow up as a slave. Even though he's Hebrew, he was adopted by Egyptians. So he doesn't have that mindset of, I can't go to God, I need somebody else to go to God. He goes to God directly, tells him, hey, just kill me because I don't want to deal with this anymore. The Israelites don't have that because they've been oppressed. So it doesn't occur to them that they can even go to God themselves. So when we get to verse 16 through 20, God tells Moses to gather 70 leaders or elders to help him bear the burden. He'll take the Spirit and put it on them too. So God was giving the option to manage a difficult situation to a group of people instead of one. And this is a solution that God gives. Okay? Then verse 20, God says that Israel will eat for 1 month until it comes out of their nostrils for being ungrateful and for discussing Egypt fondly. Then we get to verse 21. Moses asks if the cattle should be slaughtered to feed, to make this request, because God says, hey, I'm going to give so much meat, it's going to come out of their nostrils. And Moses says, well, there's like over 600,000 people. How are you, do you want me to slaughter some of the cattle? And when we look back at Leviticus chapter 17, verses 2 and 3, the Lord commanded through Moses, if anyone kills an animal but doesn't bring it to the tabernacle, to the priest, then there's like a guilt, or that's a sin. You're guilty if you do that. So that's what this made me wonder, because the next verse, God says, it's, you'll see whether my word will come true. So, because I did think that too. Like, if they're tired of what they're eating, why don't they just slaughter some of their cattle? But when we look back at Leviticus chapter 17, they would have to share it with the priest, or, I'm not quite sure how that worked and if that's still in place right now. I mean, I think it is. But this could be, when I thought about it for a few minutes and I went back to that chapter, I was like, well, that's probably why they didn't slaughter some of their own animals, because that's the only thing that would make sense. Okay, so verse 24, Moses tells Israel, okay, and he gathered the men, put them in the tent. And then in verse 28, what happened up until this point, there were two men, Eldad and Medad. They caught the Spirit and they started prophesying. The 70 men that Moses gathered together in verse 22 were prophesying, and then two men that weren't in the group began to prophesy as well. Joshua heard it. Maybe he assumed that they were not being serious or making light out of it, and told Moses that he should make them stop. And Moses just said, I wish there were more people like him. Are you jealous? And then brought him into the area with the rest of them. This is what I read. And Moses gat him into the camp, he and the elders. But then I see Moses return to the camp with the elders. I thought what happened here, or I read this as Moses gathered 70 men away from the camp or in a separate area, and then some people that were in the camp started to prophesy as well. And then Moses got them and went there. But when we look here, they returned to the camp. Again, I'm reading from the King James Version, so that's that. So basically, after this, the quails come in verse 31, and they gathered the meat, they gathered the animals, they ate them, and then in verse 33, there was a plague. And Moses writes that the Lord smote them with anger. And there was a plague that killed a lot of them. So that is Numbers chapter 11, and the next upload will be Numbers chapter 12. Thank you for watching.